Hi, this is Marie from Underground Crafter. If you're like most quilters, you have scraps somewhere in your house or in your home. And today I'm going to show you 3 ways to do really freeform projects with your scraps. So it doesn't matter the size, it doesn't matter the shape. We're going to have some fun. I'm a Baby Lock brand ambassador, and this video is sponsored by Baby Lock. So we're going to learn 3 different approaches, and I just made coasters with mine. You could obviously make them into blocks for a quilt, but we're going to do what's called crumb quilting, string quilting, and crazy quilt inspired versions. Now for these 3, they probably all look really similar because for all 3 of them I used the same set of scrappy fabric. If you watched my video a couple months ago, you know that I ordered the 5-pound bag of scraps from Vermont Flannel Company. So I have lots and lots of flannel scraps, and I've been looking for projects to work on them with. Now I have one big project that I'm working on, but I still have lots of littler pieces that I want to find a way to use up. So in today's video I'm going to show you using those flannel scraps some different projects you could work on. Now everybody has different rules about scraps. For me, I like to keep scraps separated by the type of fabric because I want to make a project that is easy for me to take care of, so something I can easily throw into the wash and I don't have to worry about all different types of fabrics and how they might shrink or not shrink and so on. So for example, I leave my flannel scraps together, I leave my cotton quilting scraps together, and I leave my kind of crazy quilt scraps, which are like upholstery fabric and things like that. I leave those together, and so that way if I want to make something into a quilt, I can easily use my cotton scraps or my flannel scraps, and if I want to make something that I'm a little more careful with how I wash it, I can use my crazy quilt scraps. So let's get started. So first off, a couple things. I keep my current littler scraps in a bag. I have much bigger scraps elsewhere, but these are just kind of ones I'm working on. These are actually scraps from the bag of scraps that I've been using that I had to cut off from projects. For these 3 approaches, I would recommend not keeping any scraps that is smaller than 1 inch, so 1 inch wide or 1 inch long, and also I don't use selvages in these scraps. There's different approaches where people do, but for me that's just easier. So if I have a scrap like this, which was part of a longer strip, I'll just keep this and then I will trim off the selvage when I go to use it. Not all the scraps are rectangular like this one, right? I have little triangle type pieces, I have really littler pieces, and I keep all those together, and so we're gonna use those to get started on our first block, which is going to be a crumb quilt block. Before we get started on any of the methods, I want to take a brief moment and talk about pressing. When you're dealing with so many scraps and so many different seams, it's really important to press the fabric between each step. It's just much easier than sewing a bunch of things together and then trying to figure out all the seams like you might on a larger block that has more even sized pieces, because there's going to be times where you might actually be sewing over the seam. Like for example, if you have a triangular piece and you're sewing it on the diagonal, you might be actually sewing over a seam from a previous crumb or previous string. So you're going to want to press it between steps. So for that, there's a couple of different options. I have an Oliso mini iron, and I do love it because it's very small and it can get into a lot of places. But as you can see, my sewing setup is really tiny, and actually the cord ends up being an issue for me sometimes. If you have a bigger sewing space, it's not going to be a problem. So recently I actually got a cordless iron. This is just so much easier for me to use at my workstation. You can also use those really small mini irons that are like just a tiny little point that you use. Basically, you just want something warm to press your seams. And I just use one of these wool pressing mats, because for the most part I'm pressing just small pieces, and so I don't need a huge pressing mat, and that lets me have more space on my table, but I can still press between each seam. Okay, a couple more things you're going to need before you get started working with lots of scraps. I keep a little bin. This is for the literal trash that I create. These are just the pieces that are just so small. I'm not going to reuse them. And I use this close to my desk because it can get really linty when you're working with lots of scraps, especially because I've been using flannel. Having a little trash can on your sewing table or right below is super helpful for keeping your workstation clean and kind of minimizing the lint so it doesn't impact your needles. And speaking of that, you should be regularly changing your needles when you're working with scraps. You're going to be going over lots of seams. In my case, I'm using flannel, which is a little bit of a thicker fabric. So make sure you really are changing your needle every 6 to 8 hours like it's recommended. And because it can be hard when you're working with lots of scraps to figure out when is the project done. You know how they usually say one per project, but you might be working on some scrappy things in between. So just try to keep track of the time. I use a universal needle. And then the last thing to prepare is setting up a portable cutting station. I use this actually cutting mat that rotates, so I can not have to move around too much and unsettle things. I can just place down whatever piece I'm working on and rotate to cut around it. And I find this is super helpful. This is Kimberly Cuts. It's exclusive to Fat Quarter Shop, and it's for 12.5 up to 12.5 inch square. So this one is super helpful. And as I said, today I'm working on 6.5 inch squares, and I also have a 6.5 inch square ruler. Of course, I could use a longer ruler, but with so many different things going on my small workstation, I just find this is a lot easier. And when you're working with scraps, you're already doing a lot of mental, you know, kind of design choices and so on. So I say make the rest of it easier. So let's look at the crumb quilt block. So one of the reasons people call it crumb quilting is it's like these little crumbs of fabric. So this is great for really small pieces that you're not sure what to do with. And it's a really freeform style because it has no stabilizer, no background, and so you're just literally sewing pieces to each other. And usually what you do is you sew a bunch of pieces together and another bunch of pieces together, and then you sew those bigger pieces together until you have whatever size that you want. So for today's project, I'm trying to make 6.5 inch squares. So I'm going to be looking to build something that's bigger than 6.5 inch squares so I can trim off the edges. So let's get started. Okay, so I started by pulling out some different scraps from my bag, and I just pressed them flat. You can see there's lots of different sizes and shapes, and I even have one piece that was a couple sewn together from a previous project. So I'm just going to take two pieces, laying them with the right sides of the fabric together and sewing on the wrong side. For my whole project, I'm using 1/4 inch seams. That helps reduce the bulk a little bit, so I would suggest using the 1/4 inch seams as well. And then I'm just going to sew them together. So now that I've got these pieces, I just clip off the edges here. Sometimes you'll have two pieces that aren't straight, so you might have one side of the seam that's way larger than the other. I would trim that off too. And so here I'm going to go to my pressing station. I'm going to press it flat first, and then I'm going to open it up, press the seams flat. So now I'm just looking for another piece that I can add to this, and this one's kind of wide the edge, so I'm going to do this one. You see that I'm going to end up sewing over one of the seams, which is why it's good that I already pressed it down. Now I don't do reinforcement stitches at the beginning and end, but if you were going to make a bunch of these crumb blocks and then come back to them, you know, months or weeks later, you might want to do that. So I said eventually I wanted my piece to be at least 6.5 inches. So this is just a guide, a quick guide. So I'm going to keep building on this strip until it's definitely closer to that. And I don't have rules when I do my crumb quilting other than I look for some of the smaller pieces that are harder to fit into other types. But some people don't like to put the same fabric next to each other, or they only use solids, or they only use prints. So you make your own rules. That's the point here. Well, it turns out I was talking to myself with the camera off for a while, but once your piece gets bigger than the size you want to make, which we're close, but not quite there, that's when you're going to really start making decisions. So we still have a little bit more to add on to this piece, but this is what it's looking like so far. Triangle here to match with that edge. So another tip is to choose which edge you're going to follow for seaming. In this case, this piece is relatively straight, so I'm going to lay it out and I'm going to follow this while I'm seaming. I'm not going to worry about all these jagged edges, and I'll trim them off later. And I usually wait to sew before I trim because I want to save as much as possible for another project. Like sometimes that's possible. But these pieces are pretty small, so they'll definitely be going in my bin. Now that last piece looks pretty big, but it actually has selvage that I'm going to trim off, but I'm going to wait until I square it up. So I am putting my ruler on, and I'm going to try to get this such that I don't have the selvage and I don't have any ends that are needing to be repaired or added to once I'm done, and this seems to have everything. This has this piece is probably too small, so I'm going to just take it off, but the rest of this is going to go back into the scrap pile. Just took the selvage off there before I forget about it. And here is my currently linty, but I'll deal with this later, crumb quilt block. And you can see there's a lot of different pieces. So I have, I think, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. There's actually 24 different pieces of fabric in here, and it's just 6.5 inch. So I got a lot of scraps used up in this. I'm going to show you on this first one how to turn it into a coaster, and that's fine if you're using flannel or wool or cotton fabric, because if you put something hot on it, it won't burn. You can use this same approach for any of the squares that I'm showing, or any of the blocks that I'm talking about today. So I cut a piece of batting and a piece of quilt fabric to the same size of my square, which in this case is 6.5 inches. And what you're going to do is you're going to put the batting under your crumb quilt square, kind of line it up, and then you're going to put whatever fabric you cut for the back on top of your square. In this case, the right sides don't matter, but if they did, you would want the right sides together so you're looking at the wrong side. I find it much easier to sew on the side with the solid fabric. So now what you're going to do is, let me make sure these are lined up. Might want to pin them. I've mentioned before I'm not a big pinner. I will take imperfect but easier any day, but if you like perfect, then definitely pin it and pin all the seams down. What we're going to do is you're going to sew it entirely on 3 sides and partially on the 4th side. So I like to start with the side that's going to be the partial seam, and I start about 1/3 of the way down. We're going to use a 1/2 inch seam. The reason for that is it's just going to be a little bit easier later, but you could use a 1/4 inch seam too if you'd like. We're going to start with a reinforcement stitches, and then we're going to sew down the edge until we have about 1/2 inch left. And if you need to stop and turn, yeah, that might be maybe one more One more, we'll say one for good luck. And then we're going to turn, and remember that the whatever fabric you're using for the back, which in this case is solid blue fabric, that's what your seam allowance is going to be based on. So any excess that's sitting out, don't worry about that for now. And then on this last edge, which is the same as your first edge, you're only going to sew a little bit down, so you want to leave a 2 to 3 inch space, and you're going to end with a reinforcement stitch. Okay, so you should have something like this where there's an opening, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to trim off all the bulk, except on this side, on this fabric here. Okay, so I can trim these down to 1/4 inch seams if I want. This side I'm just going to trim the excess. I'm going to leave this larger opening, and then I'm going to clip the corners. And instead of just cutting straight across like this, because this is so bulky, I'm going to do 2 curves. So I'm going to curve towards the seam like this, being careful not to cut the seam, of course, and the same thing on the other side, so it's kind of rounded. That's going to help me with my corners in a moment, and I can do that a little bit more. And the same thing on all the sides, kind of make these little curves to clip the corners. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my hands inside, and I'm going to pull this out so that the right side is out. Okay, and then I have this point turner that I'm going to use to get the corners more pointed out, which is harder than in most projects because of all the seams, and the seams are kind of like at unusual angles and things like that. So I'm going to use this to get my corners as pointy as I would like. Remember, you're not trying to break the fabric, you're just trying to push the corners out so that they're more pointy. This one is particularly wonky. So now I have my corners, and just for good luck, I'm gonna just press this, and I'm gonna try to press these seams in, okay, because I'm gonna be closing these up when I finish, so I don't want them to be flopping out, I want them to be pressed inside. Okay, so basically now what I'm going to do is I'm going to top stitch around, and I'm trying to seam up this edge here. Now I mentioned before that I use my Baby Lock leveling foot for this. As you can see, I unwisely left a couple of different seams pretty close to the edge there, so it's going to be a lumpy road. So with that, I'm definitely going to need to have that. You can also use a walking foot, as I mentioned before. And just for my own sanity, I'm going to clip these little threads that are poking out before I do that. Now you might be wondering, oh my gosh, do I need to quilt this before I sew it up? Nope, because the batting that I used only has to be quilted every 8 inches, and this is going to be less than 6 inches by the time I'm done because of all the seams and everything, and I started with 6.5 inch squares. So I'm going to start on this side just because I want to be super sure that I close up that edge. And I'm going to do just a 1/4 inch seam on this way, and it can be scant because I'm really, except for this opening, everything else is already seamed. It's just decorative. So you could also have a different seam allowance on each side because maybe some sides have more seams to deal with and things like that, because again, you're just top stitching here, but start with a reinforcement stitch. If you don't have one on your machine, you just sew forward and backward briefly, and then you're gonna work your way around all 4 sides. Same as before on the corners. I'm gonna take it slow just to make sure that I am working the way I want to. When I get back to the last side, I'm gonna put it on slow. I'm gonna go very slow because I want these seams eventually to line up. I don't want to have, you know, like it ends like this. I want to go kind of slow here. And then when the seams are joined, I'm just gonna put my reinforcement stitch, or again, if you don't have that, you can just go backwards 1 or 2 stitches, and then you are gonna fasten off. Okay, so gonna clip all my threads here. So this is our crumb quilt, and you can compare it to the previous one I made. You can see they're both totally unique, but they both use a lot of different fabrics and lots of small pieces. Now with the crumb quilting, it's really fun because you can use any size piece, but you tend to end up with lots of seams and lots of little strings on the back. So that can be a little bit harder for folks to deal with, and so some people prefer to do string quilting. Usually with string quilting, you're going to use longer strips of fabric, but they can still be only 1 inch, sometimes 3/4 of an inch wide. The difference is that you're going to use a piece of muslin or a piece of ugly fabric that isn't going to get seen as the background that is actually going to stabilize all the pieces together. Not using stabilizer, so by stabilize I mean just kind of keep things together. I don't mean it in the sense of a stabilizer that you might buy in a roll or on sheets. And so there's a couple things that happen with that. Because of that, all of your seams are going to be a little bit more manageable because they're actually going to be covered, and also all your threads are going to be a little bit easier to manage. So if you're working on a project where you're not going to be finishing it right away, like let's say you decide I'm going to take all my scraps and I'm going to make squares, and eventually those squares are going to turn into a quilt, but not anytime in the near future, it's a little bit easier to manage with a string quilt because you're not going to have as many little threads and seams that you have to keep track of as you would with a crumb quilt. So for that reason, some people prefer string quilting. So we're going to get started on this. Okay, for my string quilt, I'm starting with my 6.5 inch square piece of muslin. It doesn't have to be 6.5 inch square. It should be about as big as you want your blocks to be, which in my case is 6.5 inches. And it also doesn't have to be muslin. It can be any kind of ugly fabric you don't like because it's not going to be seen. It's going to be underneath. I don't recommend using something like foundation paper because that just adds more work. I know there's people that do, you know, adding machine paper and all these things, but that just adds more. But something to keep in mind is that because you have this extra fabric, it's going to be a bit heavier. On the plus side, that may mean that depending on the fabric you're using for the top and the bottom, you actually don't need batting. So for mine, because it's flannel on top, if I was going to make a blanket, I might just put another piece of flannel for the backing, or even just regular cotton quilting fabric for the backing, and no batting, because between the flannel and this and the back, it'll be pretty warm and also pretty heavy. But if you know for sure that you want to quilt, you want to have a layer of batting in the inside, just keep that in mind as you're working on this. So usually, not always, when people do string quilts, they work sort of diagonally from point to point. You don't have to do that. I mean, it's just a convention that people use. It's not like required by law or anything like that. What you want to do though is every piece that you choose, it's going to have to be bigger in that section than the muslin, you know, especially because you're going on the diagonal. So I'm going to start with a smallish piece for this corner here, and that's the only piece that's going to be right side up. I know it's a little hard to tell what's right side and wrong side with my fabric because it's basically the same, but just trust me that this piece is right side up. And then for the next piece, I'm going to put it face down so that these sides are together. And see, I couldn't use this piece, right? Because if you see, this piece is actually shorter, And once I seam it and turn it over, what's going to happen is it's not going to cover the muslin here. So it's really a little bit deceptive when you work with the string quilts. You want to be looking for pieces that are quite a bit longer than what you think you'll need. So again, I like starting with triangle pieces just because I have a bunch, but if you don't, you can use a straight piece as well. And then, does this one work now? Maybe. Let's see. Yeah, that should work. Okay. So what we're going to do when we go to the machine, same thing, we're using a 1/4 inch seam. You're going to start just above your muslin, and you're going to keep sewing to just below your muslin if you can, because you're going to trim that off later. Oops, forgot to adjust the speed back on my machine. Now the same as with the crumb blocks, we're going to press with each piece. I just press the one way on these. I don't set the seam first. I just press it open. But everyone's different. So this is what I was talking about finding a piece that covers the muslin. So even though this piece is so wide right now, I'm actually going to have to cover it starting from here, because otherwise my muslin is exposed, which I don't want. So I'm going to end up trimming a bunch of that before I sew the next piece on. So I'm going to look for a longer piece. Now these tend to, these pieces tend to be best with strips, not little crumbs like the crumb quilt. So I'm going to find a strip to go here, and I'm going to sew it. I'm going to start before where I'm running out of fabric there, where it's not covering the muslin, so that I get the whole full coverage. And the same thing, before I press it, I'm going to trim off all this excess, save it for the scrap pile. And because this has selvage, I'm going to trim that off as well. And you can do this at the cutting board, but I just find it easier this way. Okay, so compared with the back of my other project, look how nice this is. There's no wacky seams to deal with. For the most part, the threads are enclosed. It's a little bit more straightforward, but I do have some limitations on the shapes that I can use, and so that makes it a little bit more of a kind of puzzle where I'm gonna have to find the exact right piece that's the correct length to join. So here what I'm going to do, because again I didn't have a perfect coverage on this side, I'm going to use one that's thicker on one side so that I get more coverage down here, and up here it can be a little bit thinner. So I'm going to, on this side, I'm going to make sure that it lines up to where the muslin is and goes a little bit over, like 1/2 inch over. So overall you can see this is a little bit more straightforward. Ironing is a lot simpler. You just really have to iron once, and you're going to end up using probably fewer pieces of fabric overall. And again, we're just going to keep adding, and again I keep not having enough on one side, but that's okay because I can just change the angle on my next piece, and that's what I'm doing. So when I say change the angle, what I mean is that I am lining up the next piece so that it's going to cover the full area of the muslin that isn't covered by the current piece of fabric. So in other words, all of the strips are not parallel to each other. Until I check that it fits. That'll be my learning lesson. And again, I have a selvage on this piece, so I'm just going to trim that off before I continue on. I know some people keep them. I just find because they behave differently than the rest of the fabric, I don't prefer to have them on there when there's already so much chaos with all the scraps. So again, I'm going to need a pretty long piece now for the center, if you do a lot of strip quilting, you'll probably end up with lots of pieces that are perfect for string quilts. So that's another thing to keep in mind. The type of scraps you have is a little bit based on the type of things you sew already. So you might find that that's better for you. This is a pretty thick piece, but again, I'm going to keep it the way it is because I don't manage my scraps when I'm working them. Like some people are like, oh, that's too big to be a scrap, I'm gonna trim it down. But for me, the whole point of the improv quilting with scraps is that I don't have to do all that planning, so I'm gonna leave it as wide as it was already. So I'm just gonna check on the back before I trim this piece so that it's gonna be bigger than the muslin is before I trim it off. And I'm going to leave this on the side for now until I finish with this piece. Okay, so I'm back at the end here, and most likely I'm going to use another triangle since I have a bunch of triangle pieces that I'm just looking for something to do with. So let's see, will that fit? It looks like it should, so let's give it a shot. Okay, and now I'm just going to press that open. Okay, so right now you can tell I have so many fewer pieces than I had in the other. It's 2, 4, 6, it's only 7 pieces, and even if I did thinner strings, at most would be 10 pieces versus the other one had 24 or something like that. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it actually to the wrong side so I can see the muslin when I'm trimming, and that's going to help me trim a square to be the size that I'm trying to finish with, which again is 6.5 inch square. So I'm really just trying to line up my ruler as close as possible with the muslin and then trim around that. So this one is my string quilt square, and you can see my other version that's a coaster, kind of similar. It's basically a bunch of lines, a couple of triangles, but this is a little bit more straightforward. And again, if you are a person that uses a lot of strip quilting, string quilting may be for you because you probably have lots of fabric strips. Okay, so I'm clearing up my table between blocks, and something I do want to mention, if you don't want to throw out your scraps that are too small like these, you can also save them for stuffing, like if you make toys or pillows or anything like that. So if you are really trying to be super eco-friendly, they don't have to be literally thrown in the garbage. They're just too small for these type of blocks. Okay, so the last method after our string quilting, we're going to do our crazy quilt inspired method. So our crazy quilt inspired method is kind of like crumb quilting in the sense that we're going to use all kinds of different pieces, but we're going to more actively incorporate unusual shapes, and we're going to try to keep the shape a little bit odd until closer to the end so that each block is really more unusual. So for this one, you can see I started with this piece here that was actually 5-sided, and I built it kind of like a log cabin quilt block, if you've ever done that before. And so I kind of went from the center out, just adding pieces and adding pieces. And so I got kind of an unusual block, and it has more movement in both directions because it's not just lines going this way or strips intersecting. And it also has more intentionally more unusual shapes. And so these crazy quilt blocks are great if you have bigger pieces of scraps that are just weird. So for example, you have some triangles left over or hexagons or spools or anything that's not just like a straight line. They can kind of showcase that a little bit more, and again, very freeform. So let's get started. Okay, so for the crazy quilt square, I like to start with a unusual shape at the center, so either 5 sides, weird angles, something like that. These are templates that you can use if you don't want to think about it too much. I got these from Missouri Star, so I use those sometimes, but you can also just literally cut a piece that is an unusual shape. So I'm starting with this weirdly shaped scrap, and I'm going to use the Crazy Quilt template that is the biggest that will fit inside of it. Again, you don't have to use a template. You can just cut cut a square and then cut off some angles or something like that, but I'm going to use this because that's a little bit easier. And as I said, I want to keep things easy. So I lined one side to a straight edge so there's no cut there, and then I'm just cutting the other sides. Okay, so here is my wonky shape that I'm going to start with. So my Crazy Quilt inspired squares, I try to have as few rules as possible, but one possible way to build them is in the style of a log cabin quilt. So if you've never made a log cabin quilt before, you're going to work clockwise. You're going to start with one side. I usually start with the shortest so I can use up the smallest scrap first, and you're going to add to that side, and then you're going to rotate and you're going to keep adding to every side, and so that'll give you something that grows from the inside out. So I'm going to pick a smallest piece that is about the size of the smallest edge, and with these blocks you're going to want to leave about a 1/4 inch overhanging on each side. Okay, so don't line it up exactly like this. You want to have it so it's a little bit, the scrap is a little bit more centered to your main piece, with about a 1/4 inch hanging over on each side. And then, as we've been doing all along, you're going to sew it with a 1/4 inch seam. We're going to go back to how we worked our crumb quilt. We're going to set the seam first by just pressing down on it, and then we're going to turn it to the back and we're going to press the seam in one direction. Okay, so now, like I said, I'm going to rotate to the next side, which in this case is here. I'm going to try to find a piece that I can work over this side with, again, about a 1/4 inch on each side of overhang. So I'm going to go with this piece. It seems to work. Again, I'm going to set the seams, and then I'm going to press them. I'm going to actually use my my ruler here just to trim off some of the edges, straighten this out a little bit. Now this is not a square at this point in time, so I'm not trying to make it square yet. I'm just trying to trim off any excess pieces that are going to be kind of annoying as I work. Oh, this side too. And I always try to make the side as big as possible. I've mentioned this before. So trying not to cut away too much fabric if I don't have to, but just making a straight edge. Okay, so this is what I have now. So now I'm continuing in this direction, so I'm going to put a piece here. And I have these, let's see, what do I have? I'm looking for a medium long piece, maybe in a fabric I didn't already use. I know I said I don't have rules, but it's a little early to be repeating fabrics. So same thing, I'm going to leave the 1/4 inch overhang on each side, and then I'm going to sew this piece on with a 1/4 inch seam. And then set the seam and press it open. Going to trim off that edge there. And now I'm looking to go in this direction, so I'm going to look for a piece that can fit here, because again, I'm sort of rotating it around. So with this log cabin approach, you're going to end up with your smaller pieces towards the center, and they're going to have to get progressively larger as you work outward. Or you can add a kind of crumb approach where you join on some bigger pieces that are made from small pieces joined together. So it's up to you. This is your scrappy quilt block, so really do it the way that you want. Don't worry too much about any, quote unquote rules. So you can see I'm looking for a bit of a longer piece now. Let's see what I got. I might go back to that white plaid that I have kind of bigger pieces of. Yeah. Okay. and I'm going to go across this last side. And it's sort of turning a little bit more square as I've been trimming it, but in the center I still have that 5-sided shape. And I'm just going to trim a little here before I press it. So this is like a more unusual shape than I would have if I was just adding strips and things. And so that's part of what makes it crazy quilting. Now normally crazy quilting is also embellished, and I'm just trimming edges here to keep it sort of straight on the edges. And you can do that, embellish with buttons or embroidery or special stitches. But for this particular piece, because I'm only turning it into a coaster, I'm not going to do that because I want it to be moderately flat. It's still going to be pretty bumpy because of all the different seams, but I don't want it to have, you know, buttons on it and things like that. So now I did all sides, so it really doesn't matter what side I do next, but I think this is the direction I was going, so I'm going to keep with that. And this side also has a selvage, so I'm going to trim that off before we continue. I ended up with a not straight edge again, so I'm going to put some little triangle-y pieces here, and then I'll straighten it out later. And I'm going to keep sort of straightening edges as I work, trimming off excess, just to keep it a little bit more manageable to deal with. And whenever possible, trimming as little fabric as possible, so keeping the most scraps in play as I can. So my piece is getting kind of close to the 6.5 inches, so I'm not going to keep working around every side. I'm just going to be adding some more on these sides until it reaches the size that I want. And after each side, I'm just going to lay it up against the ruler and see what edges I need to add to, and do that. Okay, so for this end, I'm actually going to join two sort of triangular-ish pieces together before I add the bond, so I can kind of cover, let's see if I do it this way maybe, and then I'm going to join those to the bigger piece. And I'm going to use the side that has the straighter edge to guide my seaming. So I'm going to end up joining this here, but I'm going to straighten one of the edges first. Probably should have planned this so these two fabrics wouldn't be together, but you know what? It's pretty good otherwise, so I'm going to let it be. Okay, looking at my template, I still need a little bit on this side and a little bit on this side, so again I'm going to go with some triangle pieces that I have. This is going to be it, but we'll have to check after I put this last triangle on. Okay, it looks like pretty close, so I'm going to trim it down and then just add some little strips on the edges where it's too small. So I'm going to make it as square as possible here. Okay, so I ended up with just one side that's a little too short, so I'm going to add a piece there and then it should be ready to roll. Okay, so I'm going to do my last bit of trimming here. And that is my Crazy Quilt inspired block. You can still see the five-sided shape at the front. Oops, that's a little hang off there. And if you look at this versus my coaster, which you sort of can still see the 5-sided piece, which is a little bit smaller, you can see that they have a lot more maybe visual interest, more direction because they're rotating, and pieces kind of sort of getting bigger, but also as you kind of patch up little corners, you also have some smaller pieces on the edges. So I'm going to show you one bonus method. This is a dissolve away stabilizer. and I'm just going to cut it into a 2.5-inch strip. For this demo, I'm using a pretty short piece, but you could make it as long as you want. You could even do it lengthwise down the roll. And the reason I'm choosing 2.5 inches is because I like to do strip quilting, and that's the size, but you could cut it to any size that makes sense for something that you enjoy quilting. Okay, so with this, we're gonna take a lot of little pieces that we have left over that are hard to fit into everything else, and we're gonna make a strip of fabric with it, basically. So just like when we did the string quilting, the very first piece is going to be right side up, and then everything else is going to be face down. And again, you're going to want to have a little bit of an overhang, about 1/4 inch on each side for the pieces, but this is a little bit more forgiving than the string quilting because it's so small. Just like with the string quilting, the back is going to be encased, and you can see this is a little bent on the first piece. It doesn't actually matter. And I'm going to press it like I did with the other piece. I'm going to put my piece here with the right sides up, and then I'm just going to press it flat. Same thing, if there's any part that isn't covered, I'm going to sew my next piece over that. And this is really good for using up little pieces that may not exactly be that easy to piece into your other projects. And it's also good because you can kind of leave these strips. You can make a strip and then leave it for a while, and it's less likely to unravel as what you might see on a crumb block. And if you had really small pieces, you could make a much thinner strip. You could make it 1 inch or 1/2 inch, right? So you can really use anything that you have, anything left over after the seam allowance. And for this, I don't trim until really the end, just because it's a lot easier, or it's less work, I should say. And as I mentioned already, I just want it to be as simple as possible, so I can use up my scraps. I don't want to spend a lot of time organizing or battling with the scraps. Certainly don't want to spend a lot of time ironing, which is my least favorite thing to do, so as minimal as I can. And the reason we're using dissolve away stabilizer versus another kind is because we want it to wash out. It's not going to be a permanent part of this project. I want to show you this. This is a little melty stabilizer. So I forgot to mention earlier, you should really be pressing just on the fabric, not on the stabilizer. And when I was turning to tell you something, well, anyway, long story short, don't do what I did. It could mess up your iron, but also it's going to make it a little more annoying to cut later. So you can see on the back I have all kinds of different shapes, but they're a little easy to work with because the seams are basically enclosed in the stabilizer. So I'm going to just trim this down so we can see what it looks like. So you can use the side of the stabilizer as your guide as you're cutting, but you can also just cut with the lines of your machine. In this case, I'm going to only salvage these 2 pieces. The rest I think are too small for my particular scrappy projects. Okay, so you see you have kind of a nice strip. You can roll it up when you're done, and you can just keep adding more and adding more until it's as long as you want. You can use these sort of scrappy strips for just sashing, for binding, bag straps, all kind of stuff. Things that just, look good. If you wanted to do more of a traditional crazy quilt, you could sew a piece like this to your crazy quilt square, and because this already has stabilizer on it, you could use your machine to do some embroidery on this piece, and it would have the stabilizer in place, and then it will wash away when you're done. So that's another option for the crazy quilt block as well. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. We did a bunch of different ways to get freeform with your fabric scraps. So first we did crumb quilting, which is basically sewing pieces together until they get to the size you want. We did string quilting, which is basically sewing strips together on a muslin or another piece of fabric until they get to the size you want. We did crazy quilt inspired blocks. Those were made starting with a non-standard shape at the center, and then we sort of worked around clockwise like we might do for log cabin blocks, and then as we got closer to our size we added in little wonky pieces to make it the right size. We talked about how to turn these blocks into coasters if you don't want to make a quilt, and then we also did adding a strip of smaller scraps to make something similar to strip quilting, and we use stabilizer for that, a wash away stabilizer. So you don't want to be pulling this off at the end. You want it to just magically disappear when you put your project into the wash. And as I mentioned, for the crazy quilt inspired blocks, if you really wanted them to be more like a crazy quilt where you actually did embroidery and embellishment, adding pieces with the stabilizer is a great way to do that, because it gives you the foundation that you need to do your embroidery work or other work. So I hope this was helpful in finding ways to finally use up your scraps and understanding the differences between crumb and string and crazy and strips. By the way, you can actually buy these stabilizers already rolled up, but I like cutting them myself because I can pick the exact size that I want. So anyway, but I will put all those links down in the description. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'm happy to answer them, and have a wonderful day.